to the Zoom. And okay, so as already talked with Pablo, but just to make a short summary for you, like in relation to the conversation we had like at the end of last session and the kind of ideas there, that there could be this sort of kind of a meta book or meta game of describing how you can approach organizations as games. And that kind of, well, it doesn't quite write itself, but I think it's a much more easier to make, like given like how much more easier it was for people to make examples of such in the conversation. But I do think it also makes it easier to understand. And that can contain within it even, playable forms, playable games. But it actually, even those are easier to approach if you kind of explain the thing. And in the last week, I thought about this more, and I think there is actually a lot you can just explain by referring, look at role in a board game. Oh, my role is actually invisible. I'm not any of the tokens, but I have these rights to make these card moves, etc. Or look at a role in a board game, like in this game, I'm playing a character, but it's a certain kind. But in this game, I'm actually playing the weather or a city, or if you take weirder games. And then you use those. Oh, it's Martin's coming. Good. Um, so, uh, hello, Martin.
Hello there.
Nice that you could make it.
And I'm so sorry for missing it. Like we got a project call just basically minutes before this was supposed to.
Don't be sorry. It's nice. I really like that there is some non-militant quality to the participation also in this. Like, if somebody says I can come to 20 minutes, it's still useful and it's present. And like, don't worry about it.
I'm sorry for myself for missing the first
one. That's a nice way. But you came at a good point because you missed an interesting conversation about roles and software descriptions and the development of descriptions in the last 2 years in solo role-playing scene. So heavily nerdy stuff, but actually interesting, which relates to figurality and abstractness of language and how that can be different levels, different types of generation. I can tell you later, because it's actually very interesting stuff, even for general meaning. But we were at the point of kind of coming back to the document. We started this from the document, but and on the point that like this is really revisiting the topics that we were talking about at the end of the last session, and this idea of like if one would create a meta game or meta book of what is a game organization, and that is probably easier to make, but also easier to understand. And inside of that, yes, you can include even games, but also when I've looked at it during this week, I think it's actually rather doable. Let's put it this way, like because you can use a lot of practical examples. That's kind of where we were. Like I was saying about board games, like what is a role in a board game? If you make a comparison, like what is a role in an organization? Well, you're either in the paradigm of a member or a paradigm of a worker, like a programmer, or whatever it is. But then compare that to what is a role in a board game, which is like, I'm actually kind of invisible, but my role is actually mover and shaker of a suburb of a city, and I build buildings there, and this is what I do to build the buildings, and these are my rights there. And making these comparisons creates this in-between grounds. Like, how can this paradigm and that paradigm open up this sort of what's in between? And then you have this sort of role-playing games, which is kind of very flexible and doing all of these things. Like, yes, I'm a specific character in this meeting, I'm just fictional, but you have also role-playing games that I am playing uh, a particular building or a particular uh, family, like, and what the kind of moves of that family inside a 10-year period. So it's almost like functioning like glue, like in this. So like that opens this sort of in-between ground, just as in this example of roles, how you can start to think about what is a role in general. Like it's more than what is in role-playing games. It's more than it's what it's in board games, and it's certainly more that it's to be a worker or a member. But then you have this palette where to pick, and then you have all the example cases where you can say, well, that's an interesting approach. Maybe that could work. So from all of this, I think like this approach that we're talking about is quite promising, I guess, is the summary, what I'm trying to say, and really kind of showing itself to be promising in terms of expanding this, our understanding, um, whether it's in a case of roles or other areas of organization. And 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 this document really is just like I just put some stuff there that it's not empty. And I thought about it a bit. The one thing I thought like that everything needs an overview, especially if it's a new thing, so you explain what it is. And then the second thing I thought about that maybe it's good after the overview to go to a role, because if you are a reader, the easiest way to understand something is kind of starting from yourself. And the role is the thing closest to yourself. If you start expanding, oh, I could be like this, I could be like that, it's like a good next stepping stone. And then you can move to other structures from there. Neither of this is, of course, set in stone. I was kind of meaning to throw, which I guess I'm doing now, these to you and see what you think, and also what else should be there. So that's the process where we were in.
Perhaps a question. So
Yeah.
So the context of my question would be that in some kind of design methodologies, let's say, which are trying to kind of transcend the human-centric design, and they are trying to address or inhabit kind of non-human actors also. So, for example, that there is, let's take into account the perspective of the park or the city or the river, and kind of trying to include those in the, let's say, initial participatory mapping or kind of the research phase. So I'm wondering, because then it could be for me here, this means we are defining a character like the non-human actor, like the river, for example, and then whether there's some kind of methods or inspiration how to go about actually defining, let's say, the nature of the entity or agency. So, for example, what does it see? What does it feel? What can it affect? Like what sensors or effectors? What is the needs or pains and boundaries of kind of the system? Because sometimes it seems to me that it can be kind of hard to imagine being the river and kind of uncovering the relationships or what the river wants or needs if we use this kind of anthropomorphic language. So I was just curious whether you have some insights around this kind of embodying and enacting non-human characters.
That is a really good point. I'm just actually kind of adding it in a rough language just to have it there. Added into the end of the roles is non-human roles actors and how to make them playable, and like, but kind of like having a memento of what you just said here, like because but to your question, I think it's quite possible. Like, I mean to go back to, I mean, I don't have open, but I could pull other examples. Like, uh, it's not a vast pool of examples, but it's certainly in the dozens. But you find games where in role-playing games when you have different systems of how to make non-human actors. Like, of course, this is doing it. It's saying like the university or the river or the bridge or the labyrinth or whatever it is can make moves. And here the moves is a way I can imagine when this was written. Like first the designer came up with interesting list, like I want the university there, blah blah blah, and then probably they used this move, making this place can always to kind of explicate for themselves how are they active these places, like like here, like describe the vast amount of knowledge still left to learn, the university. Now, of course, that's a metaphoric. It's not that the university at the door starts speaking to you and describes a vast amount of knowledge, but it's you come to a library, and then you see this, and you're looking for a topic, and then you see this long row of books, and they all delve into this topic. Or you come and ask for a topic in a cafe, and you start this conversation of different people, and they go over your head. These would both be a version of that move. So, but the move itself is a way to comprise yourself. How does the thing like a university or river, etc., become active, and way to kind of make a concise version for yourself. Like here, just 3 points of what kind of actions they could be. And the one final thing I would say about this, uh, almost as a rule of thumb, every time you create stepping stones, it's like you have like one step, like you make these moves, and when the moves are made, you make the next step is like you transform them into a context, which was like the example I just made. That's usually always easier and better. It's better for expression, and it's also better for like making this compartmentalized things to think about. You don't have to think about the huge thing. You're breaking it into 2 parts or 3 parts, etc. Of course, you can make too many steps, and then people get lost in the weeds of like, I don't see it. It's a balancing thing, but generally, like a list of 30 is harder to take than a list of 5 where each one has. My math is failing. Like, is it 5 times 6? Uh, each one has 6 under topics, or like the one that has 5 with 6 under topics seems for people more cogent or more understandable. And so that's a rule of thumb possibility. But this is not the only approach, and this I could pull, now that it's been raised, I can pull other examples of how this has been approached in some other games. And it's also interesting to take, I added this topic to in the text in the video games part, because the one thing is interesting to think about in video games as not completely specific to them, but kind of like a thing that where they do a lot of interesting things is you actually have a lot of non-human roles. They're just often thought of as just as the game. You know, like it's NPCs, creatures, monsters, but it's also like how the city works, like in SimCity or whatever game. And that, if one looks at it from that perspective, you can think about that as a role. And because the city in a SimCity, or if you take a game where city is slightly more simple, because the city is kind of the point of the game, you can make an analysis of what that city actually is. It's a trading place, it's a rumor place, and maybe nothing else. Like in a computer RPG, what is a city? It's maybe those 2 things. And you can even see it like there were some older RPGs where when you went to a city, you would just see this diagram of like, do I go to the tavern? Do I go to the shop? Do I go to the inn to rest for rest and recuperation, or do I go out? And this was really kind of thinking about how the city was turned into actions in another manner. So that's another source where one could also pick up interesting cases to think about, well, how do we play the river, or how do we play the city as a kind of design approach.
Thanks.
But I do think, do say.
Yeah, no, sorry, that I'm super interested in this that Jakub mentioned, and I think we talked about it in one of our commoning calls. I'm not sure, Jakub, but I shared 2 articles of like bodies of water that were granted with rights, legal rights, which I find quite interesting. But like, as we're talking right now of how we play the river, but I'm also interested, and maybe this relates to what Jakub said, how the river plays us in a way that maybe, I don't know, if our organization is a urban farm, let's say, maybe the soil becomes a character that also has the right to vote, right? Because maybe we want to exploit it far beyond the threshold where it's healthy, but because the soil has some sensors, maybe the soil can vote like, no, let me rest one season. And we have to take into consideration sort of like the agency of the soil for us to make a decision that affects it.
Agreed. And I do think that also goes to, I'm adding it actually, that, when it's a game, you can have this sort of playful attitude, but it's almost something that you can use on a dial. It could be slightly playful or really playful. So let's say you have this river. I think I, by the way, met the lawyer person who was part of this case, who argued for it. It's a she, actually, because there was supposed to be a project with her and us at one point. Anyway, that's a side point. But like in the case of the river, like you could make it to have moves that are, first of all, towards what you want to explore with the game or whatever form you have. Like, and you could, for example, have the case that it rises in a level, and it could make that move, but it can only make that, say, in spring. Like, if that's reality, I'm kind of just generating here. So this is kind of semi-serious play. It's kind of like making into moves something that is kind of semi-simulation, but really about creating scenes that you want to happen in the game. And then there could be like, okay, when it makes this move, we throw a random dice, because and the random dice is between, it rises, say, 10 centimeters, because that starts to matter, or 30 centimeters. And that could be also informed by real world data. But it's random because, it could be either or. And then you have to deal with that. But then the case you made, like it can vote, you can say that's maybe kind of in the dial of playfulness, slightly maybe more for people, like how does a river vote? But on the other hand, if you think about it from that angle, it's kind of interesting, is because it would make that person or persons who are kind of playing the river to think about, well, how would the river vote about this? Like the city is building, I don't know, a new batch of apartments. How would the river vote in this case? And that would be then the logic of the river voting. So even if it seems more playful, it actually can even feed the serious, because it becomes this sort of a voice for the river in this sense, and then the voice kind of makes people consider that angle. So I think all of that is kind of interesting in terms of how to make the river playable, but also playable in this way of that actually serves the purposes of what is being even simulated in a way, like or towards kind of real world scenarios at least.
I guess there can be then the interesting question at some point, like how do actually this playful semi-simulation, when we are starting to interface with the like real legal or interfaces or jurisdictions, kind of interfacing with the real games quote unquote, then yeah, I don't think that's also an interesting space. But I guess yeah, that's in later stages perhaps.
By the way, practical point, Jakub, you're kind of quiet. I can hear you, but it's almost on the limit. Like maybe the mic is.
I think I used the microphone.
On the back, yeah, I've done the same, yeah. But like how does it interface with the legal environments? Yeah, it's an interesting question, but I do think it's something that you can tune. As an example from the earlier, like for example, that the river levels, even though they are thrown with the dice, uh, they actually the levels like the top end and the low end are taken from real world data. Mm, is tuning that part of the game to be more hardly connected to reality. Um, like for example, I don't know, maybe low on the river. I guess there would be examples, but I cannot think of one. But like, let's say somebody's playing a suburb, like the whole people of a suburb, and they make a certain kind of move. You could have one player, or maybe the facilitator, who can always make a call that okay, this has to be checked against the law, and they could have the actual law in hand. So in a way, like a move could be turned into a situation where it becomes this sort of like a consideration of the law, and therefore kind of a harder situation for that moment. Um, so in a way, like you don't have to put the whole structure in the same hardness. You can paint it on spots where it's needed, like the sort of like, oh, the suburb makes this proposal, and then the facilitator makes a call. Let's check that against the law, and then think about that in that situation, but maybe nowhere else.
Yeah, thank you. That's great.
But now that also Martin is here, and well, this question also Jakub, like, what do you think of what's there, and what other things you would like to add there, or what things you would like to change? I mean, this, like I said, it's really kind of more throwing stuff in there than super organized. Stop sharing at this point.
So perhaps, and I'm not sure, perhaps it's there. Let me just check the document.
Yeah.
But in regards to the rights, I'd be perhaps also interested in kind of the life cycle of the rights, or kind of the process of genesis, like from the specific, let's say, social contracts between specific people or entities, and that the rights, yeah, kind of what is the when we say right, how does it, yeah, how is it conceived of, or how does it look like when the right is being somehow defined or codified or recorded, yeah, or somehow embodied or expressed?
I think actually that's a good topic to also address in the document. Like, I mean, anyway, it should have been there, but like I can yet add it because. But let's put now stuff in, like uh, I put it super roughly. I just call it now modulation of rights. Before that, there should be like what are rights in this context, because it's not quite the normal. It's a wider sense then. But to your question, like I think actually board games are a great example in this case, both in terms of constant modulation, but also in terms of maybe like creating such structures and even maybe expressing. And what I mean by this, like, well, let's put it in practice. Like, like when you're starting a board game, you might have the right to move your piece in a board 2 steps. And you might have a right to play 1 card, just to use a simple example. But then you move your piece in the board, and in the next turn, you come to a place that allows you to buy, maybe with your card, that other than playing your card, you can use a card to pay, and then you get something from that place. So you didn't have that right before, and once you move out of that place, you don't have that right again. And of course, if I would pull more complicated board game example, we could see this constantly changing, like what are your rights? And also it's a change that once you do this, you suddenly don't have those rights, but they move to another person, you're going through a round, and then to another person, and then they come back to you, and like so on and so forth. There's constant modulation of what the rights are. But why I think they're an interesting example, because they point out also some possibilities of how to make this modulation designable. Like, for example, rights by location, not just concrete location, but this sort of scope, spot. Rights by condition is like, once you get 10 tokens, you have this and this right. Like, or once you have 1 green token and 1 red token, you get this right, wherever you are. So it's not a location, it's a condition. And then there's other approaches, but like, I think that's already like gives this way of like, it becomes this sort of a much more designable context than just being a general question. And looking at more board games offers like more and more possibilities, because really like the rights are very dynamic in board games. Like they like, you rarely keep the same things throughout the game. In most of the situations, the board changes them, things you collect changes them, and you're constantly changing your rights in terms of what happens. But it's all part of the system, and it's also, interestingly, not just part of the system that somebody designs, but it's a system simple enough that it's expected that people can keep in their heads, who are players. In some ways, I find it kind of amazing that it's even possible. Although I do think part of the reason is this sort of multi-presentation, like the fact that there is a board with signs, cards in your hand, pieces, etc., makes it more easy than, say, having it just as text. Probably would be harder to do it that way. But in this sense, yes, very much the right is always context-based. It's actually, now that we started talking about, it's true of our rights in this world. That is, our rights as citizens are based on the context of a country, or an international agreement. And there is no right, I cannot think of one, that is not based on some context. That they always stem from, and this is why the organization is so key, because every context is some kind of an organization. And then the organization, in this wider sense, includes everything from nations to cooperatives or whatever. They are actually the point where we are able to have such things as rights to our actions. So, and that's also true of everything I said about the board games. Like, the location is a context, or the game itself is a context containing subcontext like the location, but then the game also contains these rules about conditions and says somewhere like that having 10 tokens of this gives you this right, and then the game is the context that gives you that right, and so on. But there's no rights without a context first giving them. So I think it's a good topic to raise in this document, like because it opens I think quite a bit of the understanding of rights overall. Any other comments, challenges on the things there listed in the document?
I'm thinking maybe how static this roles or rights might be, and if we want to, like, what are the terms of changing them or making them flexible, or maybe them changing according to situation. Like maybe I acquire different variations of my role for different types of encounters. Like maybe in meetings I play a different role that I play in a coding pair session, or I don't know, like this sort of like, does this have to be defined, or is this just like left for the to socially emerge? I'm not sure.
I think it's good to mention, like I put to the rights, like in the under the rights are context space, like changing rights lead to can also lead to changing roles, because they can change other things as well. Because like the in a way, like the roles are composed out of rights. So, and because the rights are then based on context that issue the rights, you have this sort of like dependency pathway, like, and it's actually very clear, like, and the funny thing is, if you use this and you go to how does the nation work, how does this supermarket chain work, how does this co-op work, it's all the same, like it works for all of them. That you have this like that the context or the organization, their issues rights, the roles, while of course sometimes roles are can be soft and not all the rights are implicit, but they are based on something like rights as a rule or rights as a convention, but nevertheless it's this sense of you having a right. Actually, there's another topic can come to later, which is obligations, and why they don't exist, but that's another thing. But yeah, like, so precisely like going back to this board game example, like okay, there is a place on the board, and when you even chess, when a pawn enters to the end of the board, they become a queen. That's a change of a role by a rule, and then the rights of that piece have become the queen's rights. Of course, there's a symbolic representation of putting the queen in that place, but it's the same thing. But similarly, in a board game, there could be like there is a certain whether it's like a certain location, or once you earned enough tokens, or there is a right for the players to trade with other players their roles. Like if you say, I offer you 3 tokens if you take my role and give you your role. But if that's allowed in the game, then that's also a way of changing a role. And these are just examples, but this is good. The board game is a good way of seeing, oh, this is actually kind of, one can turn this into like fairly clear forms, and not that everything has to in human world be so skeletally clear, but having this clarity helps them to think about further, like how to expand around this possibility, and how to expand around or soften around this possibility, like the approaches to soft rules. Martin, you're
Yeah. I'm not sure that I get this formulated clearly, but like what you just said, also about this kind of supermarket, like the context question, I was just wondering, can you hear me? I think
you might have the same mic.
As Jakub? Yeah, we're sharing it. That's why
yeah,
it's
it's
like
sharing
half
the
strength
same.
for each
Yeah,
other.
yeah.
No, I was just wondering if this how this kind of viewpoint of the game takes into account aspects of power. Now you said like there were two things, and like because like could be funny in many ways, but like there were now two things that made me think this. The one is when you mentioned about the supermarket, and the other thing is what you just said, that like there might be moves, let's say, in a game that would impact upon the rules of the game. And I'm not sure if I'm making up something really crazy or you know, extraordinary. Probably that's already might be a part in many games already. But I think in terms of organizations, that might be an interesting thing to look into. And maybe if my kind of instinct sits a bit well on that side, is that maybe not what is now being tried to explore in this kind of DAO systematics, that basically the participants partake in the kind of progressive development of the rule set of the organization in which they partake. So that I could like, maybe it's a bit meta at this moment, and maybe also not super clear, but it was funny. Like, what was the other thing that you mentioned now? That yeah, this changing of roles, you know, that would kind of feel almost like a kind of rather kind of Eingriff, you say in German, like an intervention, so to speak, in the rule set. But you know, how do you do that as part of the game? Okay, I'm not sure I'm making it very clear.
No, I think you're making sense. And there are actually such board games. Like, I cannot remember offhand a game where you trade roles, but there are games where the roles are actually citadels, comes to mind, where in the beginning of a round, the roles are put in a card deck in secret, and then they pass around the players, and they choose one of the roles, and one is always left over. So, of course, the first player in the round is in the best position, and that's kind of part of the game as well. How do you get to this being the first player? Because they can choose from all, and they take one, and the last one is always left over, so you don't know even from the last player what they chose exactly. But the player who passed the two cards knows a bit. I'm getting too deep in the weeds, but it's actually a very good game. Yeah, but the point is that the roles have different rights. Like I cannot remember them offhand, but there's something like a king-like or noble-like, and they have a right to do something with money or banks, and you have an architect, and they have a right to do something with buildings and so on. But at the start of each round, the roles change because the same process goes all over and over again. So it becomes, and the game is actually, that's the main part of the game. It's not that complicated game otherwise, but because you have this sort of secret playing of roles, the game becomes quite complex also to think about this, because, well, if I was an architect, well, then I could build this, but if I was the king, noble, whatever, I could do this, and so like, and so on and so forth. Like, so that's a practical example of this happening.
I mean, maybe in a different context, or like in a different, let's say, extent, maybe, and maybe it's just good to be forgotten at this point and picked up later. But I mean, also like, I mean, this example that you brought the other day, where the question from the game master was always like, "What's your move?" or "What do you do?"
Yeah.
Right? And if I were to say as a player, well, I take 50,000 tokens now, you know, and that's not kind of warranted by any other mechanism in the game. Or I turn you into a pig or something like that. And just, I think what's so funny is that like somehow this kind of you have the right to is also just really a kind of limitation of what rights you all don't have. I mean, it's a funny formulation in that sense, because it's really a very kind of a positivist maybe framing of the limitations that you encounter. And I think what I just now got interested in while you were speaking was like, is this how is this kind of boundary considered, or is that just the point of the game kind of perspective that one doesn't consider it and one looks only at the internal entropies, or you see?
No, this is a really interesting topic. It's a big topic, but it's worthwhile to no. I think it's because it actually touches upon a couple of other points. One of them I even wrote just now down to the document, which is obligations. But like, first of all, this, like, I think rights are always a limitation and an enablement, hand in hand. Like those both sides like walk like hand in hand as a possibility. Like the enablement is the expression. Then maybe the most simple example, which I might have given at some point, but I do think it's a good example and can be comprised, is the early pre-French Revolution citizen concept, and how it was utilized in pre-revolution France, which was that you would get a right of free speech if you would become a citizen, but that would require from you that you give the right of free speech to others. So this is the kind of obligation limitation. And of course, this is kind of true in our society as well, sort of. But when it was kind of small circles in a cafe, a closed cafe, as the citizens were back then, it was very present, this quality. It's like, oh, like I have free speech with these people, but only by the fact that I kind of obliged the free speech to them. And so in this sense, like there is always this sort of limitation enablement quality in right. And that limitation might be for you, but it also might be for the whole other context. Like here, I think both apply, like in this French Revolution case. But it's also like, it's an example of a system that in their condition, it was a way to gain the right of free speech. And it's hard to imagine that it wouldn't have come without such an obligation, because those people have to allocate for your free speech to gain the right to answer back to you with free speech. Like, for example, talking bad about the king. So that's one area of it, and one example of it. But then, secondly, like there are other factors, like for example, this sort of games where you can say, "What do you do?" And then you had this example of, "I'll take 50,000 tokens." Most of these games, like role-playing games, have other logics or other factors at play. And for the typical case is that there is the game.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Let me make this more clear. Maybe the example with 50,000 tokens is not so good, but it would kind of, if I would really kind of, my move would be to change some of the fundamental battle mechanisms in a role-playing game, for example. So I would say now suddenly, yeah, you know, I'm not even versed enough to make an example, but you see what I'm trying to say, so that it really goes to the substance of the rule, not just changing the scale of an interaction, but it really kind of changes the fundamental.
Yeah. No, this is a very interesting question and has been visited. So one of the things is, once again, why game is like an organization, is that the basic presumption of game players is that this is not possible if nowhere in the game this is mentioned as a possibility. Like your rights as a player, for example, is that you have a character, but the character exists in a different world than where the rules exist. Like the rules are a meta structure, quite literally. So, and then the character doesn't have this access to the rules, and because it's not mentioned, it does not exist. But and this has been a part of the discourse because you have also have games which precisely play with what you are saying, like I'll be nerdy and resourceful by sharing my screen, and you'll be amazed how quickly I do this. For example, Flux, this game, which is a card game about with ever-changing rules, as you can see in the top left in the box. Because basically all cards in Flux are changes in the rules. And the rules of the game, there's, I think, just a couple of basic rules, but the rules of the game are mostly what's on the table. Like you see, like somebody's played a new rule. Well, the basic rules are actually on the table as well. Like it's in the middle. Like draw one, play one. That's the basic rule. But then if somebody draws a new rule and then they play it on the table, the game has changed. So it becomes a meta rule that allows the players to have this pathway of changing the rules themselves. There are other examples. Nomic comes to mind, which is a game almost like a kind of a Congress-like game, which is about formulating the rules of the game itself. Uh, and these are not the only ones. So I think you're very much on point. And there's like that. It's a very interesting area. Whether the rules are considered as a meta layer that it kind of exists separate from the game, and therefore the players cannot reach it, or is it built in a way that there's actually pathways? Like in Flux, it's definitely a pathway because you have this rule, the basic rule that you draw one, play one, and a second rule is that whatever is on the table is the rules.
But I mean,
But that,
that's the rules. That's
yeah,
the
yeah,
even those changing rules are inside the rule book.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Uh, and then in Nomic, it's actually like your move is to propose a rule. Then there is another rule that the basic rule is, I think, 50-50 voting, or like a majority voting. And then if the voting passes this rule, then it's a new rule. So for example, if you propose a rule that now the voting is 60-40 and it passes, the rule is changed. But you could propose any other kind of a rule that every proposal has to be given in a one paragraph text, not just speech. And if that goes through, then the game has changed in itself. But it's the same structure. There is a pathway. That the rules are not quite separate from, they're not only on a meta level. So
this I find really interesting. Also, like, when does it then stop being a game? Like, that's, I think, when does it when do you start? I don't know. This I find really interesting.
I would put it like this: like facing this question a lot of times and saying like it all depends, which is kind of a wishy-washy answer. But this is kind of how I lately started thinking about it, is that if you think of games as the art form of these kind of structures of behavior, where everything is free, but then these forms can harden into something like this is a real organization, or this is a form of a theater play. They can stop being just playful and become a form of its own. But so games is almost like the clouds, but if those clouds are hardened, they become other forms. And if you think of it this way, kind of everything is game. And what's the Shakespeare quote? Like we are all players. Can't remember anyway. Showing my lack of Shakespeare quotes. But oh, it's all the world's stage. He's using theater, but anyway, like this quote has been made by others that everything is ultimately a game-like structure. But like if you think about it, that the game is like where you don't have any responsibility of connecting your design to any existing cultural social form. But if what you do hardens into something like an existing thing, which people share and utilize as a platform to for interaction, then those things can stop being games and being something else. So it's almost the inverse. Everything is ultimately a game, but it can harden into something else.
I think my yeah, leading too far, but I think my yeah, I will stop.
No, but it's an interesting topic, and a practical point actually I think should be maybe in the document. I'll stop sharing this, but yeah, like let's put in the rules part this sort of rules for changing rules, because it's actually a very pragmatic case as well, because even normal organizations often contain rules for changing rules. But you can look at some of these games like Flux and Nomic, but also others, how to approach this in maybe other ways. And like it's I think a like important component, not for everything, but certainly useful in itself. So it's good that you raised that up. One thing I wanted to say about the obligations. Like in that topic that we just talked about, there is like a like the game itself almost works like our world. Like in our world, you cannot just say, I'll start flying, even if somebody gives you the right to fly, because there's this physics. And the physics say you cannot fly. And similarly, like in many games, the game itself, like the sort of meta layer, like acts like the world. It's like that's just not possible. Like let's say a game where you cannot make a move to change the rules. Like even in a role-playing game where you can do everything in this world, but your character is on a different level. The whole world is in a different level and the rules, and you cannot say, I will change the I don't know, the the combat rules in this and that way, and like it's not going to happen because it's like the flying, you cannot reach that from the world. It's actually harder than flying for would be for that for our world. But then in terms of obligations, which of course we know in many almost all organizations, things that you must do. So this is something I thought about a lot a couple of years ago, and ultimately came to this conclusion that actually obligations don't exist per se in organizations. And what I mean by this is, I think this is, by the way, recognized in promise theory. I read that later, but that there is something similar in that. But and this is one of the reasons why it's in the nature of a promise. But what it means that when some organizations say, like, you must send this, make this document and put it in this place, or give it to me in 2 weeks, there is no way for the organization to enforce that. That is, the organization cannot go into you, move your hands, and make the document in itself. And that is important because that means that that part cannot be written into the organization itself. Like strictly speaking. And while that might seem like too nitpicky, it actually is represented in organizations even as they are. is because there are ways to address obligations in organizations, but it's not as obligations. It's as conditions and consequences. Like if you approach an obligation like this, like you must create this paper and give it to me in 2 weeks as what are the conditions if this does not happen? You're back on a level that can be expressed as rules. You return into a situation that has creative power. Like if, and this also works, I was looking at this in connection with also coding organizational systems, and this was interesting because immediately when you turn it into conditions and consequences, things became back to being codable. Because you can say, if a paper doesn't appear in this slot or this folder, this and this condition triggers. And that condition could be an overseeing process, like somebody has suddenly a say on the person or whatever it is, like 100, 200 tokens removed from that person. And there could be many things, but the key thing here is that, and one of the reasons why the emphasis is on rights, not saying rights and obligations, is because that makes them two different beasts. Like the rights are something that can be expressed, and it's like can be given. They kind of form a pathway or an area that can be addressed. But then the obligations are addressed by a detour, by creating conditions. Like when we see this condition happening, that the document is not there and 2 weeks have passed, condition X, Y, and Z can trigger. That's the paintbrush to create ways to address things that were expected to happen and do not happen. And once again, by the way, the same is sort of true in board games, although they use this sort of generic condition that when they say you must make 2 moves, and you suddenly, I don't make my second move, the game stops. Nothing happens. It's like system error. But it's kind of the same thing. Like the game has no way of addressing or creating the obligations inside of you. It can just break. And for me, it's a key thing of understanding that we kind of address rights and obligations actually in 2 different ways. And after that, both of them are creatable, but you have to create the obligations by each one. Anyway, yeah, so that was something I think is important for all organizations, but it would be a useful thing to address here as well. Inside the document, because I think it makes them more creative. Also makes obligations as a creative field.
Yeah, and it seems to me that it's in promise theory, kind of analogically, it's addressed by kind of making the distinctions between promises and impositions.
Yeah.
Because like one of the premises of promise theory that every agent can only promise on its own behalf. And so even if the imposition kind of works, for example, you must do this, or I push you, then there is this kind of implicit premise to receive the imposition. And yeah, anyway, so it's kind of, I'm just recalling the possible analogs in this language.
Yeah, I think it. Yeah, I think that tracks to my memory as well. Like in the text, it's definitely addressed. Like I forget the name of the writer, but he does understand this. Like he does say this. Like but I think actually this sort of promise implication is, we don't have to go into that, but it's like for me a halfway way of addressing it, and like in this sense of like because the promise is almost like I cannot make sure, but I promise like for example, you couldn't code a promise theory like strictly to a system, but you could code the rights, certainly, like object capabilities theory is based on rights, and all of our operating systems are moving more and more into that paradigm. Like both iOS and Android are more and more object capability based systems lately. So they are based on kind of rights structures. But then if you treat the obligations as conditions, consequences, based on kind of pattern matching, that you can recognize the situation, you can code that too. And you have the same palette. And of course, that's not the only interest of coding, but it's also kind of certain structural clarity, I think, which can be brought by that. That's maybe a kind of a smaller point, and maybe not so super central, although I think it's important, but not super central for the sort of game organization. And maybe I talk about it too much because I was proud of coming up with this approach before I read, for example, Promise Theory. Actually, I was reading that part in Promise Theory made me appreciate it, because the sort of same realization going through that, like, and like, it was something appreciable. But yeah, anyway, like, is there something you think that is either missing, or is there also like qualities that you wish would be in this kind of a metagame presentation? Because I mean, processing contents in itself doesn't necessarily maybe address style, etc. So, like, would there be some kind of things that you would like to say on that end of things? Like, what would you wish from this kind of game or a metagame?
Sorry, I will just, because I will need to leave, so I will just say thanks, and perhaps then we'll think about it, and perhaps chip in Telegram. But yeah, thank you very much for this. Is like inspiring, very inspiring as always. So
No, it's okay, and you can. I think it's good. Anything written in Telegram is good, because it's good to have kind of more volume there. Even though I think the weekly meeting it's nice that it's the most lively thing. But you can also add to this document, whether it's writing in or it's editable for everybody. So either or. But even if it's not necessary, you can do, like, if you write something, you can say, I made edits to the document to the Telegram because it might inspire somebody else. So just for social reasons. But hey, thanks for being here.
Okay, thanks. So see
Yeah.
you. See
Yeah.
you soon. Bye bye.
Yeah. Bye. Yeah, I think we're anyway kind of nearing the end, but that's kind of why this question of what's missing, and also what do you think should be the style of this kind of thing? Like, if you would have it in your hands, what would we wish from it?
Yeah, maybe I'll also go through my notes and
Yeah.
write something in Telegram. But I'm thinking this really nice conversation about dices and how to access probabilistic spaces through probabilistic means. Maybe there's something interesting there. I'm also thinking, like, what if the roles change according to the situation you're in? But also, like, what if in a meeting I perform a more environmental or atmospheric role, where I become the world in this meeting, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I get those, like, maybe not just that you keep your character and it just changes, but that your whole way of interacting with the organization changes. But maybe I can develop it more in the document later, or in the Telegram group.
Yeah, definitely put anything you think of there, because I think it's definitely an area to address. I think it's underused because it's a way to, it's really perspective creation. Like you think differently if you're playing an atmosphere, and you create a different situation by that. Like having seen many games do that, I've rarely seen some game that it doesn't work. It always brings something to the game in itself. So that would be a good area.
And from my side, I enjoyed very much what we did the last time when things became really kind of when we were trying out stuff, you know, the membrane or the bridge. And so I would very much like whatever it is we're doing with this document or wherever that may go, that we could like maybe explore it through playing.
Yes.
Because like, I mean, your analytic capacity, Beko, is like super brilliant, and I think that would make in the reciprocity between like just trying stuff and then kind of noticing what's going on and kind of harvesting that into the document. I think that could be just super fun. I think I would really like that.
I think you're completely right. I was thinking for this session after last week that it might be useful to give this kind of a kick, and that would be more like content producing, like generation, like in the sense of like, I mean, contents can be kind of boring, but it can also be kind of illustrative of what kind of, it's like mapping out. But I agree.
On like, if I can just maybe say from my side, I feel just simply that I cannot, like at this point yet, maybe really kind of competently contribute to kind of what one would call a content generation or so stuff. I would really need to shove things around to see how they do, and like maybe for I'm not sure if I'm the only one on this kind of a rather low education level in this games universe, but for me just kind of to play with stuff and like kind of get an understanding of, get a bit of a feel for what are these terminologies, like how can I really kind of make them a music instrument.
Yeah.
How can I get a sense of what they do, what they mean? So kind of testing the space. Maybe before it becomes too, or like, I mean, along the way of it becoming then written into a document. But really, I lack a little bit of kind of feeling of I get this yet, and maybe just kind of a bit pushing like Play-Doh from one side to the other could help me there.
No, I think you're like really right on this. Like that moving it to the game level moves it into a much more shared space and shareable space. And it's also because like in games, it's something that like essentially all my decades have been kind of called this and that, but the games is the kind of common thread between them and many forms of games. So I have a vast library to pull. Like, oh, there's Flux. You're talking about like, but if it's a game, then that's the context. Like, oh, we made these rules and now we can play this. So it's in a way much more fair, like a setup in this sense. Like, but it's also like useful in a practical sense because it's about like how does this actually work? Like why there is this rule of thumb you should play test yesterday is because like almost every game designer knows that if you make a design and you think you know what happens in it, you're most likely wrong. You become better at guessing, but you never guess good enough, and you might be completely surprised. Like that's however well you guess. So doing this in any form, I think, depends on playing, and I think it should be the meat and potatoes of these sessions. I think like not the only thing. Like there can be other things. If you consider meat and anyway, not making
I like
metaphoric
the step
jokes.
up from bread and butter.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking because it cannot be only the boring part, because the meat is kind of considered the good part, and I think it's the good part. But then it's the meat and potatoes phrase makes it like the common part, and then that's why the metaphor works then better than bread and butter. Anyway, so but yeah, like, so I think the next step then would be to figure out like how to turn this to something in connection with this into play for next time, essentially. I think, and that's certainly possible. And coming up with that, and maybe that's actually kind of taking a certain area from here. There were many interesting areas we addressed today, actually, and like creating a game organizational situation in some of those, or some of the other interesting parts might be whether it's rules changing rules, or these roles that are not human like, or things like this. Like what is it to play a meaning if somebody has the role of an atmosphere and somebody has the role of a question, that they always include a question in their comments. I'm just improvising, but
I think it would just be nice and also maybe necessary to maybe try not to run this kind of too tightly. Like if it's a tryout phase, then let's just play. Like let's just kind of. I think you're the one who can really set up a kind of minimal frame that would allow us to kind of go explore certain things, if it's about the relationship or whatever the stuff is. And then I think we should just go and do that. And maybe you can kind of coach a bit from the side, but I think maybe we, at the risk of losing a bit of detail, it would maybe be good to have a recap of that then only in the very end of the session, and just, maybe make it a two-hour session like we are having, as a matter of fact now today, minus my missing the first 45. But so just go play, toss around some stuff, and then in the end recap, not maybe try to explore particular things. I think that will grow then.
Yeah, I agree. Let's try something in that direction, I guess, until it's set up and playing from there. Like we can see maybe there are some starting points to bring next time, but then it's really a matter of what people choose as a starting point and going from there. And the long session, this was a little bit extended because there was a kind of, everybody was kind of coming off a little bit late. So, but yeah, we could also check a bit of the time, because like I think the hour, slightly over an hour, is a good time to keep in mind. It's also for people's other commitments, etc. Like, and even with the possibility of always dropping off, I think it's still good to kind of keep it there. All right, but let's aim for that for next time, and we can see where the play takes it.
Perfect.
All right.
Very nice.
Excellent.
All right.
Looking forward. I might also, just because I said 2 hours, I might not have 2 hours next week, but an hour between and a half. That should be in the cards. Yes.
Like, let's try to keep it there, and as always, I think the having to drop off or having to drop in is always like a no problem. Like it should be like open for that. All right, but hey, thanks a lot.
So much.
And,
yes. See you next week.
And whatever the case, I think it was a good conversation, and there was a lot of points everybody brought that were really good to also be in this area of consideration that we have. So that's good that they came in. So thanks.
Thank you.
We'll do